Verse 1, and it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan in the hills and on the lowlands and in all the coastlands of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, the Termite, when they heard about it, they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors, and they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins, torn and mended, old and patched sandals on their feet, and old garments on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua at the camp, or to the camp at Gilgal, and said to him, to the men of Israel, to the elders of Israel, we've come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. And then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you dwell among us. So how can we make a covenant with you? But they said to Joshua, we're your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? So they said, from a very far country your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. Therefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions with you for the journey, and go to meet with you, Joshua, and all the elders of Israel, and say to them, we are your servants. Now therefore make a covenant with us. This bread of ours we took for ourselves, or for provision, from our houses on the day we departed to come over to you. But now look, it's dry and moldy. And these wineskins, which were filled and were also new, and see, they're now torn, and our garments also, our sandals, have become old because of the very long journey. Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, the guys from, obviously from Gibeon, from Gideon. So they did not ask counsel of the Lord becomes the next phrase in verse 14. Obviously, probably the most important phrase in the entire chapter. Verse 15, then Joshua made peace, or a covenant with them, and let them live. And the rulers of the congregation swore to them. And it happened at the end of the 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were neighbors who dwelt near them. And the children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beroth, and Kirjath Jearim. But the children of Israel did not attack them, because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. All the congregation complained against the rulers. And then all the rulers said to all the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord of Israel. Now therefore we may not touch them. This we will do to them, we will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore to them. And the rulers said to them, let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers for all the congregation, as the rulers had promised them. So Joshua called them and spoke to them, saying, you have deceived us, or why have you deceived us? We are very far from you when you saying that you're very far, we dwell very far from you when you're right near us. Then verse 23. Now therefore you are cursed. None of you shall be freed from being slaves, woodcutters and water carriers for the house of our God, which is where they served from that point on. They would serve at the tabernacle and temple, taking care of these two things, wood and water. So they answered Joshua and said, because your servants were clearly told that the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land. So they knew, this is verse 24 through 27 we see here, they knew everything about Israel, about what God had said. that they knew what the intent of Israel was being in the land. Moses, to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Therefore, we were very much afraid for our lives because of you and have done this thing. And now, here we are in your hands. Do with us as it seems good and right to do to us. Now the last two verses here. So he did to them and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel, so that they did not kill them. And that Joshua made them woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord in the place which he would choose, even to this day. Matthew 10, verse 16. Jesus said to his disciples, he said, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will devour or deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, don't worry about how or what you should speak, for it will be given to you in that hour what you should speak. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you." In these words, Jesus laid out for us what the church can expect for the rest of the church age. And that is that the place of the world that we live is a hostile place. It's not going to be all warm and fuzzies for us everywhere we go. It's not going to be easy. People aren't going to get out of our way. We're not going to be that guy in the commercial that as he pulls near to every traffic light, it changes and turns green for him. It's just not going to happen. We're going to experience frustration and resistance. And in our book of Joshua, we have not an illustration of heaven in the promised land, but we have very clearly, as we have been pointing out as we go through this book, a picture of the life of a Christian and what it is to live the victorious or the fruit-bearing, blessed Christian life in the face of adversity, not without adversity. You see, God doesn't want us to be without adversity or frustration. He wants us to behave correctly and to deal with it the way He would. So He wants to change us. He allows these things to come upon us. So the promised land is also a place of bloodshed. And I say that why? Because when we are bearing fruit, there are going to be people who just flat out just don't like the fact that we're bearing fruit. The enemy hates it when we bear fruit. Can't stand us being effective. The enemy would be fine if we would just dwell in the desert the rest of our lives, bearing no fruit, not having an effect on the world around us, no spiritual carbon footprint at all. Just kind of go in and out of this life and not have anyone listen to us or look at our lives. But that was not Jesus' plan for the disciples, nor is it Jesus' plan for us, nor was it the plan of Israel in the promised land. They were to subdue this land. They were told very pointedly to utterly destroy all the inhabitants of the land. Now, what we've read today, and as we're going to go through it again, we're going to see that they had all the information. When Israel approached the Jordan, all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, they knew already what God had done in Exodus to what we read about in Egypt. They knew what God had promised. They knew all about all the miracles, and they knew that they were coming for the land, and God gave it. Their God of the Israelites gave it to them. They had more than enough time to go find another land. They could have moved somewhere else if they really were afraid. But some of them wanted to stay, and some of them looked for a way to stay, and that's what the story tonight is really about. And so we see in verse 1 again, it came to pass, all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan in the hills. So if you're to look where Gilgal is, where they were camped out, and right by Jericho, where previously Jericho had stood before it was destroyed. If you were to look just a little bit to the east and a little bit to the north, is where these people lived. And so we have all mentioning of all the different groups of people, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites. These were Hivites, and they were just a little bit to the north and in the mountains. They heard about what was going on, and they gathered together to fight. All these kings, all these different groups of people gathered together to try to make a concerted effort. Now, finally, we see some actual, military wisdom and planning going on in the book of Joshua, where people are going to our best chance is if instead of fighting against each other, Let's all defend ourselves against the Israelites, and that's what they're going to attempt to do. Now, back in Exodus chapter 34, and also I think in Exodus 23 or 22, I'm not sure which, God said some very important things about when one day they would come into the land. I'm going to read those for you. This was critically important. So this is their accountability to what we have in this story. So it says, beginning in verse 10, Exodus 34, he said, "Behold, I make a covenant before all you people. I will do marvels such as have not been done in all the earth, nor in any nation, and all the people among you whom you are shall see the work of the Lord." You see, this is about God bringing them into the promised land as a sign to the whole world of who God is. Do you see the purpose for them and why it is God's giving them this land? So that the rest of the world would see God, not them. It wasn't about the nation of Israel. It was about God. And it was about the rest of the world knowing who God is. So the nation of Israel was going to be given this land to prosper and grow in and to worship God there. And then the plan was for that to be God's tool of evangelism for the rest of the world, that they would see the God of Israel. And so it goes on to say, "For it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, Perizzite, Hivite, Jebusite," on and on and on. Verse 12. Listen carefully to verse 12. This is Exodus 34. "Take heed to yourself." Take heed to yourself. And listen, that's the advice that it permeates the whole chapter. Every mistake that Joshua and Israel make in this chapter is because they didn't take heed to themselves. And the lesson that we can learn today is from them is we need also, as we dwell in whatever our promised land is, we need to take heed to ourselves. You know, I love Mike's question in this sense, that it kind of focuses us on, taking heed to ourselves. Are we practicing the forgiveness that the scriptures truly do define and call us to do? Take heed to yourself. What's the warning? "Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land which you're going." Now, for us, that's not about making agreements with people. It's about making compromise and agreements with what? Our sin and evil and darkness and this world. That's what this is about. We're driving out the inhabitants of our spiritual promised land. What are the inhabitants of our spiritual promised land if not unrighteousness and our own compromise and sin? Worldliness has to be driven out of our relationship with God. And that's what God's intent or purpose is. And so take heed to yourself that you make no agreements with the enemies of your soul, your sin. Don't negotiate with it. It's not about living at peace with your sin. I don't want anyone, nor do I want myself, to be at peace with my sin. I want to be at war with my sin. I want to utterly drive out the inhabitants of the land. Amen? "Lest it be a snare in your midst." And it will be. It'll be a snare in your midst. It'll keep you from the life that God wants you to have. It'll keep you from bearing the fruit that God wants you to bear, which is to his glory. "But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." You're like, wait a minute, God is jealous? God is jealous. Did you know God is jealous? God's very jealous. But his jealousy is very different than our human jealousy. See, when we're jealous, it's a matter of pride. Because if I'm jealous of something, I think I want it too for me, God's jealousy over us is for our good. He wants what's best for us. So God is jealous. He wants our worship on him because that's ultimately what's best for us. He's a purity in his jealousy. There's no sin in God's jealousy. His jealousy is his pure love for us. And so he's a jealous God, and he doesn't want us to compromise our affection or our thoughts on false gods, the false gods of the other inhabitants of the land. "Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants," verse 15 says, which is exactly what happens in Joshua chapter 9. That's what happened. They did not take heed to themselves, the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods and make sacrifices to their gods And one of them then invites you to eat of his sacrifice, and you take of his daughters and your sons. This is about the impurity of your lineage and what letting things creep in to your relationship with God. Back to Joshua 9, verse 3. When the inhabitants of Gibeon, I was saying Gideon earlier, I just get my head, my brain is so shot. Can't wait for this warm weather to come around. It's just going to make me feel alive. But anyway, it's Saturday, it's coming. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily. And by the way, your enemy will work craftily. They'll size up what methods and what things you've learned, and your enemy will work craftily. Your flesh will work craftily against your spirit and your soul. It's not going to be like blunt and bold and just say, no, this is what we're going to do. No. It's going to pretend to be something that it's not. Listen, if the enemy can't get to you in truth, there is no morals for the enemy. They don't obey God. The enemy is not worried about God's opinion of its method, And the way of the world is your enemy. Your own sinful flesh is your enemy. The demons are your enemy, and they could care less what method they use. Their major method is deception, and that's what we see a picture of here. So they dress in a way. They take the oldest food. They grab the oldest stuff, the sandals. It's like, you know what? They're just taking the oldest junk they got laying around and say, this is part of the deception. And they dress, they look like a lie, they tell a lie, and everything's a lie. And they went to Joshua, to the camp at Gilgal, and they said to him and to the men of Israel, we've come from a far country, blatant lie. Now therefore, enter into an agreement with us. We have a warning in the New Testament. Be not unequally yoked, right? Together. And this is a perfect case. Listen, when someone's coming, and where in Exodus, where in Deuteronomy do we read God's instruction of making covenants with other nations? Other than not to. Other than how to be careful not to fall into one or be deceived into one. The very thing he warns not to do is what they end up doing. And so when the truth doesn't work for your enemy, there are no limitations because there's no moral compass. There's no right or wrong for your enemy. Your enemy just wants to kill, to destroy, and to make you irrelevant spiritually. Verse 7, the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you dwell among us. How is it that we can make a covenant with you? In other words, they're remembering that God said, to be careful lest you accidentally enter into a covenant. Take heed to yourselves. Well, should this question, I ask, even be asked in the first place? It doesn't matter whether they're truly from a far country or not. Where was it said that they should make a covenant with anybody about anything? I'm just scratching my head. I'm thinking, did the Lord? No, there is nowhere. And so right away I should be like, well, hey guys, does anybody remember if God ever said anything? Did Moses ever say anything to us about when we should make covenants with other people? I don't remember that. Perhaps we should consult the Lord. Hey, listen, I'm not trying to paint myself as the expert here. I do stuff like this. I act upon human wisdom on a fairly regular basis, and sometimes forgetting to ask God his opinion. And it's a constant battle in our flesh to take the time to slow ourselves down and seek the Lord. And sometimes waiting for the Lord to do it for us rather than to do it for ourselves. No covenant with any other nation was ever mentioned by God. Verse 8, but they say to Joshua, listen, we're your servants. It's like all of a sudden it's like playing to their pride. You're greater than us. We just want to be on your side. We're with you guys. We've heard the glory and your God is great. And we're down with that. We want to be on your team. Let us be on your team. You tell us what to do. We're all about your stuff, Lie. Now, on one hand, you say, well, they actually turned out to be fairly good neighbors. They served there. They became part of the story of Israel down the road. Suddenly, Siri wants to know what I want. Sorry, Siri, I'm not interested right now. Stay. Joshua said to them, "Who are you and where do you come from?" Well, I think that's a good question. But you can't trust them. You know what? Who was it? Reagan who said, "Trust but verify." He actually originally said it in Russian, which was a Russian phrase, and it was kind of a little message to Russia, to the Russian government at the time. But trust but verify. Listen, okay, we could talk about what you're asking. First, we want to make sure that you're telling us the truth. So, we're going to send some guys back to your land. Take us to where you're from. We want to meet with your people. They didn't do any of the kind. I mean, immediately they should have, as we know, we'll see in a second, they should have just all gone, well, we'll pray about it and we'll let you know. Verse 9, from a very far country, your servants have come because of the name of this is why we came, because we heard how great your God is and we've heard of his fame. We learn at the end of the chapter, it's really their true fear of God, which is an accurate and a right thing. So they're coming, but they're lying, which is a wrong thing. But they're coming for the right reasons. They're afraid of the God of Israel. Make no mistake. By the way, so am I. I mean, the same fear that they had, I have, only I got the blood of Christ reconciling me. But I still have a fear of him. I still respect him that way. Not I'm afraid of him, but I have a respectful fear of his judgment and his correction because of his love for me. So therefore our elders in verse 11 and the inhabitants of our country spoke to us and said, go out there and make a covenant with this Israel and look at our bread. You see how it's all moldy? Look at our slippers. Look at all of our stuff, the wineskins. When we left, they were full and they were new, and now they're torn. And obviously, come on, guys, obviously, we've been on a long journey, They keep laying it on and laying it on. The enemy, again, engages us in debate, wants to try to show us evidence of what their version of the truth is. It's constantly drawing us into debate. This whole conversation should have stopped well before this. None of this should be going on. Listen, hold on a second, guys. I hear what you're saying. You go set up camp over there. We'll let you know. We don't want to hear any more till we consult with God. Literally. Rather than this debate. The debate is where the problems comes in. Where we start to, in our minds, go, oh, well, maybe I'm being a little too harsh about this thing. Maybe it's okay to go here or to do that thing, Maybe I'm judging too harshly this issue. After all, I know there's a lot of Christians doing this today, Maybe it's not wrong or bad. But you know in the past, your God has clearly said no. But you now find yourself in a situation where there's these people in front of you, and there's the enemies at your doorstep, and they're debating with you, and they're giving you all the evidence. And no, it's really not that bad. I think see, look at us. You could tell we're fine. Everything we're telling you is true. Look at the evidence here that we're fine. You could trust us. Trying to gain your trust. But the Lord said no. The Lord said no. I keep thinking of Balaam, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And even the donkey knew not to go, ended up in an argument with his donkey. The argument, it was a pretty crazy section of Scripture. So the men of Israel took some of their provisions, and there is like an examination going on here. But they did not ask counsel of the Lord. They were looking through human eyes to make a decision based on human wisdom rather than counseling with God. You see the difference? It's the same verse. They took the provisions, the wineskins, the bread, not because they wanted that stuff. They took it as evidence to examine it and say, well, they must be telling the truth, rather than ask God. Listen, the world will give you all the evidence in the world, whatever it takes to convince you. There'll be mountains and mountains of evidence. We have to go back to God and consult with the Lord. What did he say? What is he saying now? We need to ask him. And Lord, please, I'm putting this at your feet. Please show me the truth. Consult with the Lord in all things. Where was I? So, what verse was that? 14, thank you. So 15. So Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them, and let them live. And the rulers of the congregation swore to them. And it happened at the end of the 3 days after they made a covenant with them that they heard that they were made neighbors and that they were actually neighbors and dwelt near them, that they were actually, truly from right around the other side of a few mountains, mountain range. And then the children of Israel then journeyed and came near to the cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon and all these other little towns. This is all the Hivites. And the children of Israel did not attack them because the rulers of the congregation had sworn them by the Lord God of Israel. You see, when you make a covenant, it's not like what we understand today. We understand contracts, don't we? We understand, if I can find a loophole, if they fail somehow in living up to their end of the bargain, well, that means I'm out, right? No, not in a covenant. You covenanted before God with these people. You made an agreement not to harm them. Now you have to keep it. Psalm 15 is a psalm about who may abide in his tabernacle. And these are the truths of those who abide in his tabernacle. Who may dwell in your holy hill? Who walks uprightly, he who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised. But he honors those who fear the Lord. And listen to this, he who swears, that's covenant language, to his own hurt and does not change. Once you've made an agreement, so maybe you've entered into an agreement under a false idea of what the outcome would be, or of who you were making a deal with, and you regret it. Blessed is he, and he who keeps his word even to his own hurt is the one who dwells in the house of the Lord. Someone who's transparent, someone who's honest in his own heart, doesn't lie to himself. Not only doesn't he let the enemy lie to him, doesn't allow him. I'm not going to allow myself to get away with lying to myself, much less lying to anybody else. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And if I mess up, I might as well be honest about it. God knows already anyway, right? Anyway, verse 19. Then all the rulers, said to the congregation, we've sworn by them to the Lord God of Israel. Now, therefore, we may not touch them. It's the deal. You see, you can't negate a covenant without then making, even if the covenant was entered into by a sin, meaning missing the mark, doing against what the will of God was, breaking the covenant would just be adding another sin. You got to stick to your word. When you enter into an agreement, fulfill the agreement. If there's an end to the agreement and there's an understanding end, then you finish it. So, this we will do to them. We will let them, so we're going to let them live. That was the agreement, but not so fast. There's consequences for their lying. And it was never part of the agreement that they would get to continue their lives as they knew it. In fact, their lives were invaded. They became slaves from that point on. And it turns out these people were actually pretty content with that, to dwell amongst the people of Israel this way. So the rulers said to them, let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers. So water carriers, that means they were plumbers, Tyler. They were plumbers. For all the congregation, as the rulers had promised. So the consequence was imposed. They were segregated and relegated to hard labor. Now, a little bit of information about what happens later on in their lives. This is interesting. Later on, when Israel has the land, or not all of it, but eventually had some of it, they had a king, they had Saul. Saul, because of his zealousness, if you've never read this, I think it's 2 Samuel 21. I'm going to read it for you in a second. In his zeal for the house of God, starts to try to kill some of these people who are still dwelling in their midst, and that brings a curse in the nation. So I'll read it to you from 2 Samuel 21, beginning in verse 21. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David inquired after the Lord, and the Lord answered, it is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. So the king, this is verse 1 and 2 of chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. I accidentally said verse 21. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn protection to them. But Saul had sought to kill them, and his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. And so we know that David had to solve that problem later on. Verse 22 back in our passage. Joshua called for them, and he spoke to them, saying, "Why have you deceived us?" Now he's speaking to the Gibeonites who deceived them. Well, he said, why did you say we're very far from you when in fact, in reality, you literally dwell very near to us, 20-something miles, I think it was, 30 miles. Now, therefore, you are cursed, and none of you shall be freed from being slaves, woodcutters and water carriers to the house of my God. So, pardon me, an embedded enemy, the reminder, they would be a constant reminder of a failure, This is what happens when we rationalize, isn't it? We end up with the scars of our past mistakes. They're always there to remind us. We carry them around with us all the time. I think about them all the time. I think about my scars. Sometimes if I allow the enemy to force me to dwell on them, it takes me out of the present glory. I don't get up here in this great passion and fire. I get up here carrying around the burdens of my past. But those scars are also there for a good reason. They're there to remind us that if we don't take heed to ourselves, if we're not careful about entering into agreements with the enemy, with our flesh, with sin, with temptation, we'll have to carry around scars. We'll lose out in the end. So they answered Joshua and said, "Because of your servants clearly told us that the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land." So why did we lie to you? Because we knew that your great leader Moses had prophesied that your God was going to give you our land and destroy all of us and the land from before you. Therefore, we were very much afraid for our lives because of you and have done this thing. And now, here we are in your hands. Do with us. Now, this is like a surrender of your enemy, complete surrender of your enemy. So listen, subjugation of your enemy is a good thing. If you can put your enemy and bring it under control, it's a good thing. And that's kind of, again, it's more of a picture of the actual Christian life, isn't it? We have a tendency to live out the rest of our Christian lives keeping our enemy subdued. Sometimes we can't completely get rid of it. It's always around us to remind us. And that's the reality. So now here we are. We're in your hands. Do with us as it seems good and right to do to us. And so he did to them and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel so that they did not kill them. And that day Joshua made them woodcutters, water carriers to the congregation. Listen, they're segregated. They're separate. Interestingly, much like Israel was when they were in Egypt, but for different reasons. But so you have to deal harshly with your enemies. And if you will not deal with your enemies in truth and in transparency and brutally, they will come back to be a problem, an irritant for you. Amen?